The inventory listed everything: the oak escritoire in the study, the silver service for 24, the cellar, 43 bottles of claret, 11 of port, 3 of something the solicitor's clerk had simply written as unknown, possibly French, the 2 working fireplaces and the one that had been sealed since 1887, the linen cupboard on the 2nd floor, the roof repair outstanding since the spring, and then near the bottom of the 3rd page, in handwriting slightly smaller than the rest, as though the clerk had been uncertain whether to include it at all: 1 dependent, female, residing in the East Wing, status, unclear. Gideon Lorne, the Earl of Carwick, read the line twice. Then he set down the inventory on the solicitor's desk and said, very quietly, "1 dependent. Yes, my lord. As in a person. As in a person. Yes." He looked at the solicitor. The solicitor looked at his hands, and no one thought to mention this before the sale was completed. The matter was somewhat complicated, my lord. Her name was Beatrice. She had been called that her whole life, first by her mother, who had died when Beatrice was 4, and then by the handful of servants who remained after the money ran thin, and then by no one at all for a stretch of years when it seemed easier not to draw attention to the fact of her existence. She was 23 years old. She had lived in Thornfield Park her entire life. She knew where the kitchen pipes froze in January, which stair on the back staircase creaked if you stepped on the right side rather than the left, and the name of every elm tree in the east garden, not because anyone had named them, but because she had done it herself, at age 9, with a seriousness of purpose that had never entirely left her. She had not been told the estate was sold until the morning of the sale. Mrs. Dunmore, the housekeeper, had come to her room with the particular expression she wore when she had to deliver news that was going to be difficult for everyone. Beatrice had been at her desk, copying letters, not her own, but the late Earl's, sorting his correspondence into some kind of order after 4 months of no one having done it. And she had looked up and known immediately that something had happened. "Lord Ashvale has finalized the sale," Mrs. Dunmore said, "to a Mr. Lorne. He holds the earldom of Carwick." Beatrice had set down her pen. She had looked out the window, at the elms she had named, at the gray November sky above the stone wall at the east end of the garden. She had breathed once carefully. "I see," she said. "He arrives on Thursday." She did not say, "This is my home." She did not say, "I have nowhere else to go." She did not say any of the things that were pressing behind her teeth, because Mrs. Dunmore already knew them, and saying them aloud would only make them real in a way that was not useful to anyone. What she said was, "I'll make sure the East Wing is presentable." Mrs. Dunmore looked at her for a moment. "He'll want to know who you are." "Yes," Beatrice said. "He will." She turned back to the correspondence. She did not have an answer to give yet, so she set about finding one. The late Earl, her father, had left no will that anyone could locate. Or rather, he had left one, and then apparently revised it, and then the revision had disappeared, and the original referred to intentions he had expressed verbally but never committed to paper, and the solicitors had spent the better part of 4 months untangling a situation that, one of them had told Mrs. Dunmore privately, was the most aggravating estate matter he had encountered in 31 years of practice. The long version of it was this: the late Earl of Ashvale had had 1 daughter, born to his wife in 1893, and his wife had died, and he had loved his daughter with a quiet and somewhat helpless devotion that had expressed itself primarily in never formally registering her existence with the title's entailment documentation, because he had not wanted to draw attention to the fact that she would be unable to inherit under the standard terms. He had meant to resolve this. He had meant to do a great many things. He had died in October, 4 months before anyone had thought to ask where Beatrice was supposed to go. The estate had gone to Lord Ashvale, a distant cousin she had never met, who had sold it within a month to settle his own debts, and that was that. What Beatrice had was her name, her father's name, which was Wycliffe, and which meant something in Shropshire if nowhere else, and a handful of letters he had written her over the years that she kept in a box under her bed, and the knowledge, bone deep, that this house had been hers in every way that mattered and in almost no way that the law recognized. She had decided, in the 4 days between Thursday's announcement and Thursday's arrival, that she would stay. She would stay, and she would find the will revision, which she was almost certain existed, because her father had told her about it in August, 6 weeks before he died. He had said, "I've seen to it, Bea. Not the way I wanted, but it's done." And then he had gone to sleep in his chair by the fire, and she had not thought to ask what that meant, because she had not known she would need to know. She would find it, but she could not search for it openly, because Lord Ashvale had already transferred the estate, and any document she surfaced would be contested immediately. She needed time, and access, and a reason to be in the house that no one would question. So she had put on her plainest dress and told Mrs. Dunmore that she would serve as a member of the household staff for the time being, and Mrs. Dunmore had looked at her with an expression that was equal parts distress and reluctant understanding, and had said, "He'll find out." "Yes," Beatrice said, "but not before I do." Gideon Lorne arrived on a Thursday in a carriage that was considerably less grand than the one the previous occupants of Thornfield Park would have used, which Beatrice noted with something that was not quite satisfaction but was adjacent to it. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30 or just past it, with dark hair and the expression of a man who has arrived at a place expecting to assess it and has already begun doing so before he's fully through the door. He stood in the entrance hall and looked up at the ceiling, then at the portrait gallery, then at the staircase. He did not look at the staff lined up beside the housekeeper's table. Then he did, and his gaze moved down the line with the brisk efficiency of someone reading a balance sheet, and it landed on Beatrice and paused. She kept her face still. She had practiced this. Her hands were folded in front of her. She was wearing the dress she'd chosen carefully, serviceable wool, nothing that would draw a second glance from anyone who wasn't looking for it. And she had pinned her hair back, and she was standing in the way. She had observed the housemaid's stand, which was slightly different from the way she naturally stood, and she watched him decide what she was. He looked away. "Mrs. Dunmore," he said, "the East Wing. I'm told there's some question about it." "The East Wing is in good order, my lord. I was told there was a—" He paused, consulting something in his memory. "A dependent. Yes, my lord. Where is she?" The silence lasted precisely long enough to be uncomfortable. Then Mrs. Dunmore said, "She assists with the household, my lord. She's been here some years." He looked back at Beatrice. She met his eyes and then looked at a point just past his shoulder, which was what you did. "What is your name?" he said. "Bea, my lord." It was not entirely a lie. It was what her father had called her. "Bea," he repeated, as though testing the word for information it might not be giving him. Then he turned back to Mrs. Dunmore and said something about the accounts, and Beatrice breathed again. She had 3 weeks, she judged, perhaps 4, if she was careful. The document, whatever form it took, whether it was a revised will or a letter of intent or something her father had told his solicitor in confidence, would be somewhere in the study. Her father had kept everything in the study. The problem was that the study was now the Earl of Carwick's study, and he worked in it for approximately 6 hours a day with a regularity that she found both admirable and deeply inconvenient. She had established, within the first week, a workable pattern. He rose early. He breakfasted alone. He spent the mornings at the desk and the early afternoons walking the grounds with the estate manager, a man named Forsyth, who had served her father for 18 years, and who looked at Beatrice every morning with the expression of a man sitting on a secret he was not entirely certain he should be sitting on. He returned to the study in the late afternoon. He dined at 7. She had the study to herself between 6 and 7. When he was dressing for dinner, if she was quick about getting there, she was quick. She was also, unfortunately, not quick enough on the Wednesday of her second week, when she was on her knees behind the desk with her hands in the bottom left drawer. Her father had kept the drawer locked, but she knew where the key was, had known since she was 12. And she heard the door open and did not have time to do anything about it. There was a pause. She stood up slowly, with the key in her hand, and looked at him. He was standing in the doorway in his evening coat, and he was looking at her with an expression she could not read. And the thing she noticed, absurdly, was that he did not look angry. He looked careful, as though he were revising something he had already decided. "What?" he said. Are you doing?" It was not quite a question. The inflection was too flat for that. She could have said, "I was cleaning." She could have said, "I was looking for something I left here." She could have said a number of things that would have bought her another day, possibly 2, and then the thing would have collapsed anyway. What she said was, "I'm looking for my father's letter." The room was very quiet. Outside, she could hear the wind in the elms. "Your father," he said, "the late Earl of Ashvale." "I am." "I was." She stopped. She started again. "My name is Beatrice Wycliffe. I am his daughter." He did not throw her out. She had expected he might. She had thought through the possibilities, lying awake in the small room off the east corridor that had been hers since childhood, and the range of his responses had included, at the practical end of the spectrum, immediate dismissal, and at the less practical end, fury. What she had not particularly anticipated was that he would pull out the chair from behind the desk and sit down and say, in the tone of a man making notes, "Tell me." So she told him. She told him about her father, who had been a good man and a disorganized one, who had loved this house more than he had loved being practical about it. She told him about the years after her mother died, which had been quiet and a little lonely, but had also contained the elms and the kitchen garden, and Mrs. Dunmore's particular way of making quince preserves, and the study with its smell of old paper, and her father's pipe tobacco, and the sense, persistent and unearned and real nonetheless, that she was home. She told him about August, about the chair by the fire, about "I've seen to it, Bea," and her own failure to ask what that meant. She told him about October, and the weeks after, and the slow, terrible understanding that there was nothing official with her name on it, nothing that would hold up, nothing but letters and memory, and the knowledge of which stair creaked and what the pipes did in January. She told him, and he listened, and she watched his face and could not tell what he was thinking. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The will revision," he said. "You believe it exists. My father was not a man who said things he didn't mean." "No," he said slowly, "but he was apparently a man who said things without writing them down." That was fair. She did not argue with it. "The drawer you were going through," he said. "Is that where you think it is? I think if it's in this room, it's there." He kept, she paused. He kept the things he didn't want found easily in the bottom left drawer. He thought no one knew where the key was. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "I'll give you a week," he said, "to search properly." "With the lights on." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because," he said, standing and straightening his coat, "if the document exists and you find it, we will need to determine what it says, and what, legally, can be done with it. And if it doesn't exist, I would like to know that as well." He moved toward the door, then stopped. "Also," he said, without turning around, "because you have been living in this house under a false name doing the work of a housemaid for 2 weeks, and whatever else is true, that is. I don't think that is something a person does for no reason." He left. The door closed. Beatrice sat down in the chair behind the desk, which had been her father's chair, and she breathed. She found it on the fourth day, not in the drawer. The drawer held letters and a small leather journal that turned out to be her father's record of his various experiments with the kitten garden, which was not legally useful, but which she sat with for longer than was probably productive. The document was in a different place entirely. Inside the cover of a copy of Middlemarch that had been on the shelf above the desk, for as long as she could remember, its spine cracked from reading, her mother's name written in the front and tucked inside the cover, in her father's handwriting, 3 pages. It was not a formal will revision. It was a letter addressed to his solicitor, stating his intentions with respect to the estate and his daughter, and it had been signed and dated in September, 6 weeks before he died, and the signature had been witnessed by 2 people whose names she recognized: Forsyth, the estate manager, and Mrs. Dunmore. She read it twice. Then she sat very still for a moment in the late afternoon light. It did not give her the estate. She had understood, even in hope, that this was probably not possible. The entailment was what it was, and her father had not found a way around it. What the letter said was something different, that a sum of money held in a private account, separate from the estate's finances, had been set aside in her name, and that it was hers absolutely, and that his intention, had he lived, had been to use that provision as the basis for contesting the entailment on her behalf. He had not been able to do that, but the account existed, and the letter specified the bank, and the letter specified the amount, and the amount was, she read it again, enough. Not enough to buy the estate back, not enough to undo what had been done, but enough to be something other than a dependent with unclear status, which was more than she had been on Thursday. She brought the document to him that evening. He read it standing by the window. She stood near the door and watched the light change outside, and tried not to let herself feel too much until she knew what he was going to say. "Forsyth knew," he said. "Forsyth knew. He didn't say anything to me. He didn't know if he could. He didn't know what you intended." He lowered the pages and looked at her. Outside, one of the elms moved in the wind. She knew it by the particular way it moved, the slight asymmetry at the 3rd highest branch that she had always meant to ask someone about. "What do you intend to do?" he said. "Go to the bank. Speak to the solicitor." She paused. "Leave, I suppose." "Leave." He said it neutrally, but she thought, she was not certain, but she thought that there was something in the word that was not entirely neutral. "This is your house," she said. It was never going to be mine. I understand that, and if I suggested," he said carefully, "that leaving was not the only option." She looked at him. He was still holding the letter. Outside, the elm moved again. "That would depend," she said slowly, "on what you were suggesting." He set the letter down on the desk. He did not say anything immediately, and she had the sense of a man who had been thinking about something for several days and was now trying to find words for it that were adequate. "I bought this estate," he said at last, "because I needed somewhere to manage that wasn't in the middle of a city. I am not," he paused, "I am not well suited to a great deal of company. I am told I am too quiet for London and too serious for the country, which I take to mean I am appropriately suited for neither, and must locate myself somewhere in between." He looked at her. "This house has been someone's home for a very long time. You know where things are. You know which pipes freeze. You know—" He paused again, and she thought she saw something shift in his expression. Something that was not his usual careful assessment. "You know the names of the elm trees." She went very still. "You know about that, Forsyth told me. He said you named them when you were 9. His mouth moved again, that same not quite smile she had seen in the study. "He said you gave them all very sensible names." "I named them after prime ministers," she said, before she could stop herself. "I was going through a phase." This time it was not almost a smile. It was an actual one, brief and a little surprised, and it changed his face considerably. She felt something shift in her chest. She had not been expecting that. "Miss Wycliffe," he said, and it was the first time he had called her that. The first time anyone had called her that in 4 months, and the sound of it was something. "I am not suggesting anything improper. I am suggesting that if you wish to remain, there would be a legitimate reason for you to do so. The estate requires her someone who understands it. You understand it. And the financial provision your father left means you would not be doing so as a dependent, but as—" He seemed to consider the word, "as someone with standing. You're offering me a position," she said. "I am offering you—" He stopped. "I don't entirely know what I'm offering you," he admitted. "Something that isn't what you had, but isn't nothing. I think that is the honest version of it." The honest version of it. She looked at the desk where the letter lay. She looked at the window. She looked at him. "I'll stay until spring," she said, "to see how the pipes do." The cousin arrived in January. His name was Neville Croft, and he was the late Earl's nearest male relation after the distant Lord Ashvale, who had sold the estate, and he had apparently been simmering about the sale for 3 months before he arrived on a Monday with a solicitor and a set of arguments that the solicitor presented in the drawing room with the expression of a man who is not entirely certain the arguments will hold. The argument was this, that the sale had been made in haste, under terms that did not fully account for the entailment-specific provisions, and that there was a question, a legal question, the solicitor said, a matter for the courts to review as to whether the transfer of title had been properly executed. Gideon listened to this with the particular stillness he brought to things he found very irritating. Then he said, "The sale was executed by Lord Ashvale, who held the title at the time, with full legal authority witnessed by—" He named the solicitors, the date, the documentation. He had done his research. Beatrice realized, some time ago before January, before Neville Croft had appeared in the drawing room with his solicitor and his grievances, which meant he had anticipated this. She stood near the window, which was where she had chosen to be, present but not forward, and watched him dismantle the argument with the methodical patience of someone who had prepared for exactly this. Croft turned to her at one point, sensing perhaps that she was not an ordinary bystander. "And who are you?" he said, not pleasantly. "Beatrice Wycliffe," she said. "The late Earl was my father." Croft stared at her. The solicitor stared at her. She met their eyes calmly and said nothing further. The claim died in the room that afternoon. Not quickly, Croft's solicitor made several additional attempts, and Croft himself was the kind of man who mistakes persistence for argument, but it died. By 3 o'clock they were back in their carriage. By 4 o'clock the drawing room was quiet again, and Mrs. Dunmore brought tea, and Gideon sat across from Beatrice in the chair nearest the fire and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. "Your father's letter," he said. "You brought it with you." It seemed prudent. She had kept it in the small folder she carried, her father's handwriting, 2 witnesses, the bank, the amount. Evidence of her reality in a world that had tried very hard to make her unreal. "Yes," he said. He looked at the fire. "Yes, it was." They drank their tea. Outside, the January wind moved through the elms. She could hear the one she'd named Walpole, which always made a particular sound. And the house was quiet in the way it had always been quiet, which was not the quiet of emptiness, but the quiet of something that had been inhabited for a long time and had got used to the presence of people. "I should tell you," he said after a while without looking up from the fire, "that I looked into your father's letter, the account. I spoke with the bank." She set down her cup. "When?" "December." He paused. "Before Croft. I wanted to be certain the provision was sound before in case it needed to be defended. He had done that in December. He had done that before she knew he might need to." "You didn't tell me," she said. "I didn't know how. I wasn't certain what it meant to you, or what you would." He stopped. He looked up, finally, and there was something in his face that was more unguarded than she had ever seen it. "I didn't know what you wanted." The fire crackled. Walpole moved in the wind outside. "I wanted this," she said quietly. "I wanted this house. I wanted my name back. I wanted—" She paused, and then she said the honest version of it because he had offered her the honest version, and she owed him the same. "I wanted someone to know I was here." He was quiet for a long moment. "I know you're here," he said. The spring, when it came the way it always did. Slowly, and then all at once. The kitchen garden had survived the winter. The pipes had frozen in January, exactly where she'd told him they would, which she would be honest and admit she had found slightly satisfying, and he had found her satisfaction in this apparently worth noting, because he had written it down, somewhere, which she had discovered when she found his notebook open on the desk one morning and seen her own words quoted back in his careful handwriting. "East pipe, behind the panel, third from the left." She said December. It was January. Close enough. She had stood and looked at that for a long time. In March, the question of spring was raised again. She had said she would stay until spring. Spring had arrived. He raised it on a Tuesday, which was characteristic. He was a person who did significant things on ordinary days, without ceremony, which she had come to understand as his way. "You said spring," he said. He was at the desk. She was returning a book to the shelf. She had been reading her way through the study, which had become one of the things she did in the afternoons now, in the hour before he returned from the grounds. "I said spring," she agreed. She did not take her hand off the book. "Is that still?" He paused. He had a slight difficulty with certain kinds of sentences. She had noticed this months ago. He could speak at length about drainage and legal documentation and the specific mechanical failures of agricultural equipment, but certain other sentences seemed to require a different kind of effort. "Do you still intend to go?" She turned around. He was watching her with the expression he'd worn on the night she'd told him who she was, careful, revising, waiting for information. "Do you want me to?" she said. "No," he said, with no pause at all. She had not expected it to be that simple. She had spent quite some time anticipating a complicated version of this conversation, with qualifications and conditions, and perhaps a certain amount of strategic ambiguity, and he had said no with the same directness he applied to drainage and legal documentation, and the east pipe behind the panel. Third from the left. "I have the money my father left," she said. "I'm not a dependent anymore. I know, and I have my name, Wycliffe, whatever that's worth." "In Shropshire," he said, "it is worth something." She almost laughed. "That's where you've settled on." It seemed accurate. He stood up. He moved around the desk, not quickly, not with any particular destination, in the way he moved when he was thinking rather than going somewhere. He stopped a few feet from her. "I don't have a great many ways of saying things," he said. "I find I usually just mean them plainly, if that suffices." "It suffices," she said. Outside, the spring was happening. The elm she'd named Walpole had put out new leaves, bright green in the March light, and she could see them through the study window from where she stood. "Then stay," he said, not as an instruction, as a request. Not as whatever the other things were. As yourself. She looked at the window. She looked at him. She thought about her father in his chair by the fire saying, "I've seen to it, Bea," and the long, uncertain months afterward, and the drawer behind the desk, and the letter inside the book in January, and the pipes and the notebook with her own words written down in someone else's hand. "Yes," she said. It was the honest version. All right. The house, as it always had, stood at the end of its long drive behind the elms. She read the letter again that evening, her father's letter, all 3 pages, and then she put it back inside the cover of the book, and put the book back on the shelf, and went down to dinner.